Hi, my name's Nick Barker, and this talk is called Intuitive Education and the Mental Warehouse. So, in summary, if you don't have the time or the patience to watch the entire talk, there is a general perception that the modern Western education system that all of us go through isn't teaching us what we need to thrive in the workplace, to actually put our knowledge into practice. A lot of the reason for that is because the education system teaches us explicitly using facts, equations, and structured assessment, whereas when we get into the workplace, it requires that we understand things intuitively, identifying patterns, relationships, and systems, and understanding how to actually apply our knowledge to a real situation. So we really need both of these things to achieve mastery of a subject. We need a lot of knowledge, but we also need a lot of intuition and understanding. But the problem is that essentially in the modern education system, we're actually teaching these things in the reverse order of how we should actually be teaching them. Intuitive education and understanding should come first, and explicit education and knowledge should actually come later. So a little bit of background on what we're talking about here. It's no secret that we spend an enormous amount of time, money, and effort on education in our society. It's one of the things that we consider to be the most important as a group goal. There are 3.7 million teachers in the United States alone, and the Department of Education has a yearly budget of about $70 billion at the moment, which is a lot of money. But unfortunately, despite this immense investment that we're putting into it, there seems to be this general feeling out there in society that the education system doesn't adequately prepare us for the workplace. Like, you'll hear it's a very common opinion that people have that new graduates from university don't necessarily have the practical skills they need to succeed in their job when they start on the first day. And also important is that I believe there's a growing concern that the approach to standardized testing, an assessment that is done by school districts, by departments of education around the world, is encouraging and incentivizing a particular type of rote learning and memorization and other short-term strategies that are designed to maximize marks in exams rather than actually encourage a holistic approach to learning. So first things first, there's an enormous amount of very intelligent people working on education. Really, really great teachers, really great educational researchers out there. So why isn't the problem improving? Why isn't the process of education improving faster than we kind of see it happening out in the wild? And I am going to propose in this talk that we're actually attempting to solve the wrong types of problems. I think that the problem is not so much with the content that we're teaching in schools or the way that we're teaching it, but it's actually a much more fundamental issue than that. And of course, when we want to talk about fundamental things, we have to start with some fundamental definitions. Now, this might seem a bit silly and reductive, but I think it's actually very important to try and answer the question, why do we educate? Why do we teach? Why do we educate people? Why do we have an education system? Because answering these simple questions from first principles can help us locate the source of some deep problems. So the definition that I'm going to be using in this talk is that education simply teaches us to solve problems and perform tasks. That is what the underlying purpose is. There are a lot of side effects, but that's kind of what the central purpose is. A doctor is expected to learn through the education system how to diagnose and treat diseases. A carpenter is expected to learn how to build things using wood. Education is attempting to teach us how to respond to a problem or a task in a particular domain with a specific solution that solves the problem. And I think it's actually really helpful to imagine our brains in this context, our minds, in these particular domains like a warehouse. So If you imagine that the problem that you're trying to solve, the task that you're trying to perform is like an order coming into your mental warehouse. We need to look through the warehouse, find the right box on the right shelf, retrieve it, and ship it, right? So what we're talking about in this analogy is that the facts and the approaches that we learn explicitly in the education system, the knowledge, that is the boxes on the shelves, right? And the intuition or the feel about relationships and systems, people call this the feel for the job, the understanding that we develop while we're working or trying to solve a problem, those are the shelves and the system of organization in our mental warehouse. So of course, if we extend the analogy a little bit, a warehouse full of organized shelves is useless if all the shelves are empty, right? You can't respond to any orders in a warehouse if you have empty shelves. But conversely, if your warehouse is just a huge pile of boxes all over the floor with no system of organization, that's also useless because you'll never be able to find the right box to actually respond to the order. So we need both knowledge and understanding to achieve mastery. We need explicit education to teach us the knowledge, the facts, and we need intuitive education, hands-on education, to teach us the understanding and to build the best warehouse that we can. And here lies the fundamental problem, which is that the current education system that we have teaches almost entirely explicit education. So we're going to have a bit of a look at what the terms actually mean, explicit versus intuitive education, so that we can compare and contrast them and understand how each contributes to the way that we learn. So the first thing that we're going to look at is the method of instruction, or how we actually teach each of these different styles of education. We're going to look at the content, which is what we're actually teaching. And of course, important is the method of assessment, which is how do we assess whether the teaching succeeded or failed. It's actually very important. So we'll start with explicit education. And if you're watching this video, chances are you have already experienced a decent amount of this in your life. It's what you expect from modern education systems. So the way that we teach it is by direct instruction. I'm talking about listening and watching, listening to lectures, reading textbooks. It's primarily a one-way communication of information from the teacher to the student, right? What we're actually teaching in explicit education is storing precise facts, processes, or structures, right? We incrementally build up, starting from the simple bits of knowledge, moving up to the more complex ones. We generally follow a standard syllabus. So someone's decided you learn these facts in this order from beginning to end. And it's also really important to note that what we teach in explicit education is about accuracy, right? It's about finding the correct answer. You'll notice that if you've been through a modern education system, there is a bit of a fixation on getting the correct answer out the end, right? And then finally, the way that we actually assess whether the teaching succeeded or not is also something you're probably very familiar with: standardized testing, exams, assignments that you have to do in your time outside of school, numerical assessment like 0 to 100 scores or A to F scoring, pass or fail. And of course, there's also statistical comparison with your peers or bell curves. So often how you do actually depends on how other students do in these types of tests as well. So just some really explicit, I guess, examples of explicit education. Well, I mean, this talk is explicit education when you think about it, but something that you might have encountered in school is like a mathematical formula in a textbook or a lecture. That's explicit education. You're expected to learn the formula and then apply it precisely without making mistakes. Exam questions like label all the parts of the cell that require recognition and being able to recall facts from your memory. Or what is the present continuous form of this verb, like in French, for example. You're required to remember how to apply this process and to apply it to the correct example that they give you and get the correct answer at the end. You can also even use explicit education when you're both the teacher and the student, when you're teaching yourself. So for example, if you're learning language vocabulary with flashcards or that type of rote memorization, that's also explicit education. You're teaching knowledge and you're prioritizing accuracy, getting the correct answer as the measure of whether it succeeded or failed. And just a reminder, explicit education, all of these facts, these figures, all this knowledge, these are all the boxes on the shelves in our mental warehouse. So now we're going to have a look at intuitive education as a contrast to explicit education. So intuitive education, you actually will have experienced even if you've never been to school, because it's something that we primarily do as children. Children learn very intuitively. So the way that we teach intuitive education is through self-directed learning, through students engaging with a system and getting feedback from it, creative processes, that type of thing, but also through simulation and through play, through intuitive education games, for example, or simulations that provide a safe environment for experimentation. Of course, we also teach on the job. So what we're teaching in intuitive education is developing that feel or the subconscious understanding of the rules, the relationships, and the patterns underpinning a system, right? So when we talk about knowledge in explicit education, we're talking about understanding in intuitive education. How do the facts relate to each other? Why is this important, not just what it is? And another important thing to talk about here is that in contrast with explicit education, intuitive education is all about approximation. It's about really quickly getting to roughly the area of the answer that you're looking for, whereas explicit education is much more about accuracy, precisely the correct response, right? And one of the reasons that intuitive education is not anywhere near as present in schools as it should be is that it's much harder to assess in a standardized way, or even a way that a computer can do, right? You can get a computer to analyze a multiple choice test and mark it for you, whereas if you want to assess someone's intuitive feel for a subject, they need to self-assess. You need teacher assessment, you need peer assessment, for example, can work, but it's also subject to bias and a whole lot of other things that makes assessing intuitive education much more difficult, right? So some examples of intuitive education, you might not have thought about this, but learning to sing, learning to dance, these things that are considered very human on a base level are incredibly intuitive. You don't learn to sing by looking at the anatomy of the throat and understanding, okay, I have to tense my vocal cords and then I have to tilt my larynx to this angle and then I have to push air from my diaphragm like that. You learn to sing by just trying and by your interaction with your body, clenching your muscles, pushing air out, and then hearing it in your ears. That feedback loop intuitively allows you to start to understand the rules of the system. In contrast to learning a language as an adult, as we talked about before, learning your native language as a child is an incredibly intuitive process. Children aren't thinking about verbs and adjectives and nouns. They're not thinking about grammar. They're not thinking about vocabulary. They are just trying to express themselves, and they're trying to communicate, and they're trying to get things done through using their language, which allows them to develop very quickly an intuitive understanding of the rules without necessarily having that accuracy. You see, it's about approximation. A child might be able to say a sentence that you can understand even though the grammar is a bit incorrect, right? It's not perfect, but it's approximate and it's most of the way there. And the third example is, of course, learning on the job in an apprentice or as an apprentice rather, or in a trade. So, if you're learning to become an electrician, often you'll start working very early on in your education process. And then in parallel, the person who is mentoring you through your apprenticeship will teach you the correct bits of knowledge. They'll give you those little bits of explicit education right when you need them. So, you'll be looking at something and they can tell that you're trying to figure out how it works, and they'll give you the information. And what this is akin to is you've just created the shelf in your mental warehouse by seeing, oh, okay, there's got to be some way that these things fit together. And then the teacher comes along and they give you the box to put on the shelf. So just to recap, Intuitive education, that's the shelves and the way that you organize things in your mental warehouse. And explicit education teaches you the knowledge, the facts, all the boxes that fit onto those shelves. You need both of them. So it's important to point out, like I said, that what we teach in the modern education system isn't useless by any means. I'm not actually criticizing teachers. I'm not criticizing the syllabus or the system. What I'm saying is that, your warehouse obviously needs to be full of knowledge. You need heaps of boxes on the shelves to be able to respond to that input. But the problem here is not the boxes, but it's the order that we learn things in, not the things themselves, right? You can kind of describe this as like the box problem, and you can see where I'm going with this, which is that because we almost entirely do explicit education in schools, what we're doing is essentially filling a huge warehouse floor to ceiling with boxes that have no system of organization, right? They're just everywhere, all over, on top of each other. That's all the facts that you learn in school, right? There are just arbitrary facts and knowledge and stuff everywhere. It's actually kind of a miracle that we can pass exams by cramming the night before. And the way that I think about this is that the night before, your brain basically says, okay, I know we're going to need this knowledge tomorrow and all in one place. So what we're going to do is just squeeze that little pathway between those boxes down on the right, walk 50 meters back into that room, and then the third pile of boxes on your right, that's where all the exam stuff is. So just go there, you'll find all the stuff related to the exam, and you might be able to remember where that location is for a couple days. But if you come back and try and do the same exam like a year later, you'll probably fail, and to me that's an indication that the knowledge hasn't stuck, because you haven't developed any long-term system for organizing how that information relates to everything else. You don't have the intuition, you don't have the shelves, you can't find the boxes. So, lots of problems. Obviously, talks are not interesting if they only propose problems with no solutions. So here we're going to have a look into some proposed ideas of how we could change the education system a bit to teach intuitive education before or alongside, but also how you can apply these kind of procedures in your own teaching or learning. So, obviously the solution is quite simple. If you're building a warehouse, you want to build the shelves before you put the boxes in. It's common sense, right? In a practical sense, this happens automatically as part of work experience or apprenticeships. Like when you're doing this kind of learning on the job style thing, you're building the shelves as you're trying to solve problems. You're saying, oh, I obviously need a solution. The first time you ever learn to join two pieces of wood together, you're looking at the two pieces of wood, you're looking at the thing you want to create, you're like, oh, I obviously have to join these two pieces of wood. That process is building the shelf. And then when someone teaches you how to make the join, that sticks really well because you now have a good solution to your problem, right? What it boils down to is, if you're a teacher, just try to avoid teaching a concept to a student before they have anywhere to store the concept in their mind. If they can't relate that concept to other concepts or to some use, they're just throwing the box on the floor somewhere and they're never going to find it again. So at the university level, the problem's probably the most easy to solve because you already have like quite a bulk of education behind you at that point, of some fundamental base skill level. So my proposal is basically get students into the workplace doing the actual work on day one at the same time. They start university, day one, into the workplace, part-time at university and part-time in the workplace, right? Do the explicit education alongside the intuitive education. There are two major reasons why this is a much, much better approach than what we do now, which is like 4 years of intense knowledge, explicit education study with a teensy little bit of like fake work stuff in there. The first one is that it's just much easier to memorize and retain information if the student can see immediately how it's going to be used as part of their job. You just have a better ability to memorize things that you actually have a use for than things that are esoteric facts that aren't related to other things. But the second thing that I think is almost more important than that is to do with how students choose their subjects in university. If you've been through university, unless you were the most dedicated student who had really thought hard about where you want to go in the future, chances are you chose the subjects that you did kind of arbitrarily, if you had any choice, right? If students were working, right, at the same time that they were at university, when it came time to choose subjects for the next semester, they would have a much, much clearer idea of what kind of subjects they wanted to do, because, you might have seen something at work or been asked to do a task at work that you did okay, but you didn't really fundamentally understand, the base of it, the foundations. And then you see a subject at university, you can think, oh, I need that subject to apply to my work. And it also creates a very strong feedback loop with universities, because at the moment, universities do claim to be preparing people for the workplace. They claim to be essential in training people to work in, knowledge work, for example. So I think it would be really important if students were able to give immediate feedback on whether courses were actually useful to them in the workplace or not. At the high school and middle school level, this is your 6th to 12th ish year of school. It's much harder to get intuitive education in there, and the main reason is because in order to do this, we would need a really wholesale shift away from standardized testing. I think standardized testing, exams, assignments, these are the types of things, bell curves, these are the types of things that encourage and incentivize the use of explicit education. And I think we need to get away from those if we want to start to teach students a more intuitive understanding of the depth of the subject. One thing that I think is a reasonably easy pivot to make in some cases, and I've read case studies of teachers successfully doing this, is allowing students to guide their own exploration of the subject through curiosity rather than just rigidly adhering to a curriculum. Rather than saying, we're learning this week, we're learning something else next week, we're learning something else week 3. You allow the students to pursue their own curiosity through the course, and you just help them with little shortcuts. If they're getting stuck or if they get some inaccurate information, you correct it for them. Allowing them to guide it allows them to build the shelves in their mind because they can understand why the fact is actually useful. A modern thing, but using games and simulations of an initial driver of skill acquisition rather than traditional lecture and pupil-based is actually something that has been shown in some cases to be very effective. What you'll find is that even if you just do a little bit of this interactive learning where students just get to explore within the subject before you start bombarding them with stacks of knowledge and facts that they have to remember, they will probably retain the knowledge and facts better if they have shelves to put the boxes on. So some examples here is teaching maths in the context of building a video game or creating procedural art, this of building a little simulation, doing this type of thing so they can understand how the maths actually applies, right? Rather than just learning these abstract things in isolation. Or another technique I've heard of that seems to be very effective is in high school commerce or economics. People run simulated stock markets where the students are given fake money to invest in a safe way with a market that actually tracks the real stock market. And so each week, the teacher can talk about what happened in the market, why certain things affected some other things. It can create a context by which students can really build those shelves which they need to be able to organize things. Now, at the elementary school level, funnily enough, in the first few years of elementary school, it actually has a pretty good mix of intuitive and explicit education. I don't think I would necessarily, I don't think I'm qualified, for example, to point out anything that would improve that wholesale. I think the first 3 years of elementary education with good teachers are actually done very well. I suspect one of the things that allows them to exist like that is the fact that standardized testing and exams and stuff, even in gifted and talented programs, doesn't really kick in until the 4th or 5th year of elementary school. So that's like an important kind of distinction to make there. And it's also, I think, worth pointing out that something I see which is very, very common these days is people saying that, oh, I was a gifted child. I was called gifted. Everyone said I was smart when I was in elementary school. When, first 3-4 years of elementary school, I could read really well, really early. I could do maths, everything. And then from high school to university, everything went downhill and I started to fail things, and now I don't know what I'm doing, that type of stuff. I've seen this over and over again, and there are definitely other compounding factors here. This is not entirely an explanation, but I think for me personally, I'm a very intuitive learner. I have terrible trouble remembering things in isolation or rote applying processes that I don't actually understand. So what I think happened to me was that I had a really easy time in elementary school because things were very intuitive. All the education was designed so that, you built things up from first principles. You really developed a deep understanding of things, even though they were very simple. But then when you get to high school, there's this kind of hard pivot into standardized testing, into exams, into assignments, into explicit education, where memorizing a large number of things or being able to force yourself to memorize things that you don't understand is critical to your success. And I think that hard pivot there is possibly to blame for this gifted child syndrome to some extent. There are obviously a lot of other things going on there, including neurodivergence and among a lot of other stuff. So let's say you're not in a position where you can change education policy for an entire country, which is most of us. If you're an individual and you want to know what you can kind of do to move towards a more intuitive education approach. Let's say you're a teacher, right? As I said before, try to let your students lead the process of learning. This is, of course, assuming that they're motivated and there isn't other things going on. Allow them to seek answers to their natural questions, right? So if they have a question, go down that path. Allow them to go down there. Just provide the guardrails for them, right? If they're getting stuck and they can't figure something out, but they obviously know that something's supposed to be there, just give them the box, right? Give them the correct box rather than them having to figure it out themselves. Because if they've already built the shelf, they'll be able to store that really easily. They'll be able to remember exactly what you tell them if they understand why it's useful, right? You want to try and design learning so that students feel a real need for the information, right? Before you teach it to them. If they have no context, like I said, don't give them the information yet. Withhold it if they don't understand how it's going to fit in. Something that's kind of obvious, and that I think a lot of people are on board with, is that you want to avoid one-way lecturing, right? Of course, which is you don't want to just get students into a class and just talk to them for 60 minutes and then tell them to leave, right? Obviously, a lot of people understand that that's not ideal, but one step further than that, I think you also want to avoid what's kind of referred to as guessing the teacher's password, right? That style instruction where it's like one-way lecturing or textbook learning, whatever, which is just punctuated occasionally by, can you tell me why something? Right? And then the student has to try and guess the password to continue, basically. Or what do you think why means? you don't want to do this type of thing. What you want to do is allow the student to actually arrive at the conclusion for why something's important, and then help them understand the simple, accurate reason why. So if you're a student and you're interested in intuitive education and you think it could help you learn and retain information more easily, the spoiler is that it can, there are also things that you can do in isolation, even if your education system in your country or at your school is not supporting you. And the most fundamental rule that you have to think about is it's essential that you attempt to put the thing you're learning into practice as soon as you can, right? If you're a person like me, there's a very low limit to how many things you can learn in isolation without ever putting them into practice. So if you're learning a language, seriously, start speaking the language you're learning with native speakers as soon as you can, or reading books in that language, even if they're just kids' books, as soon as you can. Give yourself an external reason, or rather, get some external stimulus that can help your brain understand not only which things are important, but how they relate to each other, not just a list of the things. If you're learning maths, find out how the maths that you're learning is used in real life. Or in puzzles, or in specific simulations, or something like that. And then try and solve some of those problems yourself. Don't just learn one thing after another and stack the facts on a big Jenga tower, Finally, games and simulations are actually getting really, really good. There are some phenomenal games out there that will help you, really, really help you develop an intuitive feel for the subject. Like if I was teaching physics at high school, I would definitely encourage kids to play Kerbal Space Program. There's a very nice, accurate physics simulation in there, and knowing how to actually do the calculations will help you be better at the game. So in that kind of case, you'd allow the student to play the game, and then you would watch them crash their rocket, and then you would give them advice about you see, this equation describes, this ratio between these two things, and that can help you not crash the rocket, Another great example is Flight Simulator. Very accurate. If I'm sure that playing a lot of Flight Simulator would improve your ability, your chances of becoming a pilot in the long term, because it just allows you to get that initial intuitive feel for the lay of the land, how things relate to each other, how it all comes together as a big picture, and then you can start learning all of those little pieces. So, a lot to take on there. In conclusion, the important things to remember are, as a student, don't blame yourself for not being able to memorize things with no context. As a teacher, don't blame yourself for not being able to get your students to memorize things with no context. It's not what humans were designed for. Our brains are kind of geographical in nature, based on locations, So focus on where to store the information, not just the information itself. So when you learn a new fact, it's not just a new fact in isolation. It's what is it for? How is it used? How does it relate to other things that I know about this, right? Do I have a shelf to put this information on, or am I just putting this box on the floor? Just think about that. Every time you learn a new thing in isolation, it's like, am I just taking this fact and just putting it on the floor somewhere and hoping that I'll be able to remember it later? It's really important to understand that knowledge is useless without understanding, and understanding is useless without knowledge. So you need explicit education to teach you that knowledge. It's essential, of course, but you also need intuitive education to teach you that understanding and how the knowledge, different pieces of knowledge, relate to each other. Thanks. I hope you enjoyed this talk. And if you did, I also have another talk on intuitive education games and how we can create enjoyable games that don't feel like educational experiences, that can kind of hack information into your brain. Thanks.